The first thing Admiral Vor saw before he understood he had already lost was a human soldier passing a metal bowl to a frightened child while artillery walked across the district behind them. The shelling shook dust from the ceiling, the lights flickered, and the soldier waited for the child to take the spoon before taking his own. Vor watched from his command carrier in high orbit, 6 magnified feeds open across the tactical wall, and he spoke in a flat voice that made his bridge crews quiet. He said, "Increase pressure on food sites. Their command has reduced itself to ritual. The species seeks comfort while encircled." Marshal Sierra 10 stood at his shoulder and approved the order within a breath. She had spent 4 days describing humans as insects pretending at civilization. Her certainty had become doctrine on Vor's bridge, and doctrine had become targeting priorities. Kitchen heat signatures had received more fire than breach corridors. Supply courtyards had received more surveillance than armored staging alleys. That misallocation had left one ring of the siege weaker than the rest, and a relief fleet was already moving through that ring with drives dark and weapons hot. Inside the city, Captain Lena Ibarra listened to the final encrypted packet from Corporal Nadia Volkov and looked at Sergeant Joe Park over the table map. The packet contained an intercepted coalition line from 10 to Vor, one sentence that would later help convict them at tribunal, and one sentence that made the current hour survivable. "Continue punitive strikes on communal food points," the alien transmission read. "Primitive feasting behavior predicts terminal complacency within one cycle." Joe allowed himself half a smile, the kind soldiers used when someone else had made a catastrophic professional decision. "If they think Stu is surrender, we should disappoint them on schedule." The coded signal blocks were the reason the relief fleet had reached Cinder 9 at all. Every message burst to orbit had been hidden inside meal logistics traffic, wrapped in the city's routine request stream for water allotments, fuel gel pulls, and ration lane updates. The pattern looked boring to hostile analysts. Boring patterns survive longer than heroic ones. Outside, the first hull of the relief task group knifed through cloud cover, 11 hours later than the original jump window, exactly where the adjusted plan required it to be. Vor finally understood why humans had fought to preserve 2 hot meals per person per day under bombardment. He understood it 4 days too late. That morning became famous for the explosions. The more consequential history started 23 years earlier with a treaty written by people who still believed contact could remain polite. In 2038, the first contact framework between the Terran Union and the coalition worlds established non-interference norms, transit rights, and battlefield conduct codes that looked comprehensive on paper. The language covered targeting categories, civilian protection, and medical corridors, yet food infrastructure remained implied rather than explicit, folded into broad utility clauses. Lawyers called that adequate. Soldiers quietly called it a future argument. For 2 decades, the treaty mostly held because both sides profited from it. Trade lanes expanded, science missions exchanged personnel, and mixed arbitration panels resolved minor incidents before egos hardened into doctrine. Admiral Vor served as a junior captain in those years, building a reputation for strict procedural compliance and aggressive interpretation. He followed rules precisely while selecting readings that benefited him. The fracture line appeared in 2039, when the Helios Gate corridor became contested across 3 systems with overlapping historical claims and new antimatter transit value. Coalition survey ships moved markers. Terran patrols removed them. Limited naval clashes followed, each side insisting the other had fired first, each after-action report written for domestic audiences hungry for certainty. Marshal Sierra 10 entered the command picture as political overseer for the coalition expeditionary bloc. She had risen through ideological ranks by arguing that compromise with younger species only trained disobedience. Her speeches carried ceremony, contempt, and a familiar strategic blind spot. She mistook restraint for weakness and patience for fear. Captain Lena Ibarra first encountered Ten across a negotiation table 2 years before the siege during an inspection dispute in a neutral dock. Ten addressed her as if addressing a disobedient child. Ibarra replied in a measured tone that made neutral observers take notes. "For 20 years, Lena said, we have honored corridor law and accepted inconvenience to preserve peace. We will continue honoring law. You will find that courtesy should never be confused with incapacity." Ten laughed and recorded the exchange for propaganda. The clip circulated in coalition channels with subtitles labeling Lena primitive and theatrical. In human command schools, the same clip became a lesson in strategic composure under insult. By 2034, political appetite had outrun diplomatic control. Vore received command of the coalition siege group assigned to Cinder 9, a mining world with one major urban node, Havelock City, and a hardened logistics complex beneath it. Human planners expected Cinder 9 to face pressure if Helios claims escalated, so they had spent years digging storage vaults, reinforcing water loops, and stockpiling shelf-stable rations calibrated to exact mass. Dr. Eamon Rhee, a civilian nutrition scientist on temporary assignment, had helped design the city's emergency intake models. He expected to publish quietly and return home. History had different plans. Vore's coalition ring closed around Havelock with textbook precision, and his operations brief projected surrender within 72 hours. Intelligence projected fear cascades once civilian supply anxiety reached visible levels. Ten endorsed that model publicly and privately, and she demanded a high-visibility surrender ceremony before the fourth dawn. Inside the city, Lena assembled battalion leads, municipal coordinators, and key civilians in a concrete transit station converted to command. Sergeant Joe Park was present because he managed field feeding coordination for 3 infantry companies before the ring closed. He arrived carrying grease pencil maps and a list of kitchen teams, which drew one raised eyebrow from a skeptical staff major who wanted every available hand on barricades. Lena asked Joe for his recommendation. He answered, without flourish, "Keep 2 hot meals per person per day, soldiers and civilians alike at fixed times. If we drop heat and rhythm, cognition slides fast. Decision speed falls. Rumors replace orders. We can absorb shelling damage. We cannot absorb command drift." The major objected with the confidence of someone who had never watched a city unravel from hunger anxiety. He argued that hot meals were indulgent under fire. Joe corrected him in plain terms that left no ambiguity. This is doctrine, not comfort. Before we enforce equal ration discipline, civilians hesitate to work defense shifts because they assume troops will take priority. Equalize intake and schedule. Mistrust drops, labor lanes stay open, evacuation lanes stay orderly. That makes your barricades possible. Dr. Eamon Rhee backed him with hard physiology. Warm intake improves compliance and gut absorption under stress. Cold calorie bricks keep bodies alive. They do not keep teams thinking clearly on R36. Lena resolved the hesitation in one sentence that changed the week. Kitchen priority stands. Joe has authority to requisition labor, fuel, and transport equal to ammunition transfer. That order solved a specific obstacle. Before it, logistics officers could refuse kitchen requests as non-essential. After it, food movement became protected command traffic, and the city could coordinate routine under bombardment instead of reacting in fragments. Day 1 opened with artillery ranging strikes and drone sweeps, searching for mass movement around known mess facilities. Coalition analysts expected ration panic. They saw lines, steam, and people waiting in disciplined silence. Joe and his teams served lentil protein stew from reinforced transit bays, while infantry rotated through in squads of 8, helmets on, rifles slung, spoons steady. A teenage volunteer asked Joe why everyone had to sit for 6 minutes before returning to positions. He pointed to an analog clock taped above the serving station. Because 6 minutes together keeps rumors from inventing the battle for us. Orbital observation recorded every tray and bowl. Vor watched the footage and interpreted it through contempt. Ten leaned over his shoulder and offered a smug assessment that would age poorly within 48 hours. Observe the primitive feast instinct. They gather at predictable intervals and expose personnel density. We can break morale by humiliating appetite. Vor approved precision strikes on main kitchens. His gunnery officers executed efficiently. 3 large galley sites were cratered before dusk. The strikes resolved the human command's final hesitation about decentralization. Until that moment, some officers still hoped central kitchens could survive with concealment and decoys. The destruction made the risk mathematically unacceptable. Lena signed Joe's contingency within 10 minutes. 24 microgalleys would replace the destroyed hubs by dawn. The number mattered. Fewer than 24 left districts uncovered and travel lanes exposed. More than 24 diluted trained staff and fuel control. Joe had rehearsed this grid for years on paper, expecting never to use it. By midnight, school basements, machine shops, clinic garages, and rail maintenance closets were boiling water under filtered vents. Corporal Nadia Volkov worked signals in a converted archive room 3 floors below street level. The kitchen dispersal solved one problem and created another. Every microgalley needed timing updates, fuel draw confirmations, and district queue instructions, which generated heavy internal traffic. Heavy traffic made hostile interception easier. Nadia studied coalition listing patterns from the first day and noticed their analysts dismissed logistics chatter as low-value noise unless it matched military call sign syntax. She walked into Lena's command with 3 pages of probability estimates and 1 blunt recommendation. Bundle tactical bursts into meal logistics envelopes. They ignore food chatter. We can hide relief synchronization inside schedule updates. Lena asked for confidence level. Nadia answered, high enough to survive this week. Joe listened, then rewrote his dispatch template so every galley report carried harmless visible fields and 1 encrypted payload slot keyed to meal window codes. That adaptation solved a specific obstacle. Before it, direct tactical bursts risked easy classification and jamming. After it, command coordination moved inside traffic the coalition had already chosen to undervalue. Day 2 brought the heaviest kitchen target bombardment of the siege. Coalition gunners struck thermal signatures in 8 districts, expecting food collapse by afternoon. They hit empty decoy burners in 5 districts and low-capacity prep sites in 2. 1 real micro-galley took casualties, and Joe spent 9 minutes in rubble with a pry bar and 2 engineers pulling a cook named Miri out from a beam while shells landed 3 blocks away. Miri looked at him through dust and blood and asked if second meal service was still on time. Joe answered in deadpan, only if you keep arguing with me, which suggests you are fit for duty. She laughed once, coughed once, and returned to stirring a pot 2 hours later with her arm in a sling. Alien observers interpreted continued meal timing as stubborn denial rather than adaptive command resilience. 10 appeared on coalition internal broadcast and declared that humans were expending strategic capacity to preserve ritualized feasting. Her speech lasted 4 minutes and became a prosecution exhibit at tribunal. Inside Havelock, Day 2 closed with a harder decision than fuel allocation. Civilian shelters in the North District reported fear that soldiers were receiving larger portions, and that rumor spread faster than shell fragments. Lena could not ignore it. Joe could not disprove rumor with speeches. They needed visible equity. At dawn on day 3, Lena announced equalized rations across all registered persons, military and civilian, with identical portion mass and identical meal windows. Some frontline platoon leaders protested privately, worried their troops needed extra intake before night operations. Dr. Rhee proposed a compromise rooted in physiology and fairness. Keep core meals equal for legitimacy and cohesion. Add tightly controlled task supplements only for units on sustained heavy labor, and publish the criteria publicly. That solved the obstacle in a measurable way. Before equalization, civilians hesitated to assist fortification crews and distrusted movement instructions. After equalization, volunteer rosters filled within 6 hours. Barricade repair accelerated, and evacuation lanes remained open because citizens believed the system was not preparing to abandon them. North District wardens logged 0 ration riots that night, which kept the shared lanes clear for ambulances, engineering trucks, and evacuation columns when bombardment shifted after dark. Day 3. Evening brought the first meaningful intercept that shifted strategic leverage beyond city walls. Nadia's team captured a coalition operations exchange routed through a relay drone with weak encryption rotation. The transcript included 10 urging intensified strikes on communal feed points to precipitate surrender optics, plus VOR's authorization code. Intent and command responsibility were now recorded. Nadia printed the line on paper, old-fashioned and impossible to spoof once signed. She carried it to Lena and said, "This proves they know these are communal sites and keep striking anyway." Lena nodded once. "Archive 3 copies. 1 to legal cache, 1 to relief command, 1 stays with us in case power fails." Meanwhile, off-world relief planning entered its own crisis. The Terran relief fleet assigned to Cinder 9 had missed its original jump window by 11 hours due to a reactor isolation event in staging. The delay threatened the synchronized breakout design. Arrive too early, and the siege ring remained dense. Arrive too late, and Havelock's fuel gel reserves would drop below safe cooking thresholds, which meant the communication camouflage would collapse with them. Task Group Command transmitted a revised timing protocol encoded through Nadia's meal traffic channels. Joe adjusted meal windows by small increments that looked like ordinary queue management inside the city and harmless inefficiency from orbit. In practice, those shifts aligned urban combursts with the fleet's new approach geometry. Admiral VOR saw timing fluctuations in food distribution and interpreted them as strain indicators. His analysts briefed him that meal interval jitter suggested approaching nutritional failure. VOR accepted the conclusion because it matched his prior belief. 10 reinforced it because her political narrative required it. Confidence replaced curiosity on their bridge, the most expensive substitution in military history. Day 4 began with rain over Havelock and static across half the coalition sensor net. Joe stood in a rail tunnel kitchen watching steam collect on cracked tile while Dr. Rhee checked hydration ratios. Rhee looked exhausted, gray at the edges, voice frayed. He had slept 6 hours across 3 days. He still corrected a volunteer who overfilled sodium concentrate by 10 grams because 10 grams across a city could become arrhythmias by dawn. At 9:20, local, VOR convened a command review after receiving contradictory reports. Human resistance had not broken, riots had not materialized, and combat patrols were still coordinated with unsettling precision. He replayed footage from every meal window and noticed something his staff had missed. Squad leaders arrived in patterns that mirrored sector command boundaries. Civilians exchanged paper slips at line entry, then disappeared to specific districts. Wireless burst traffic peaked exactly when serving ladles changed hands. The realization hit hard enough to silence the bridge. Humans were not merely feeding themselves, they were executing command and control under cover of feeding. 4 immediately ordered a rushed assault cycle to crush the network before the next full meal window, and to build that assault mass, he pulled screening ships from the western arc into inward-facing strike lanes around the city. Vore demanded options. Staff officers proposed renewed blockade pressure and negotiated terms. 10 rejected both and called for immediate ground assault to exploit what she framed as exposed congregation nodes. She delivered a long declaration across command channels, heavy with contempt and performance. These primitives hide military orders in domestic ritual because they lack disciplined communications doctrine. They gather like children around fires while claiming strategic intent. Strike now. Strike in daylight. Strike their feed corridors and show every observing world what happens when lesser beings confuse appetite with warcraft. Our coalition did not come across 3 systems to be mocked by kitchen smoke. Her ultimatum resolved Vore's political hesitation while locking in the tactical vulnerability his own redeployment had created. Before her pressure, he could still choose a patient containment posture and rebuild ring depth. After accepting her demand, he kept the fleet in rushed assault geometry, timed to human meal windows, exactly when relief forces were due to hit his thinned western arc. Lena watched assault telemetry arrive and understood the window had opened. She gathered command staff, neighborhood coordinators, and exhausted platoon leads in the central chamber where every wall hummed with power conduits. Her speech carried no theatrics. It carried memory, patience, and final decision, and it became required reading in officer academies 5 years later. For 23 years, we have been courteous under treaty frameworks, even while those frameworks were bent against us. For 5 days, we have remained disciplined under siege, while our civilians and soldiers ate from the same pots and held the same lines. We hoped Admiral Vore and Marshal Ten would choose restraint once they saw the city refusing panic. We hoped they would choose law once warned that communal infrastructure is not a target board. They chose poorly. You know what comes next because you built it with your hands. Sergeant Park kept routine when routine looked impossible. Dr. Ree turned equations into endurance. Corporal Volkov gave us a voice the enemy thought was noise. Every district chief kept trust alive when fear wanted shortcuts. Our relief fleet is inbound on the adjusted clock. We break the ring when they strike, we protect non-combatants as we move, and we accept surrender from any crew that powers down and complies. We are not here to prove we can destroy. We are here to prove we can end this and still deserve the peace that follows. Joe heard that speech while handing out second meal bowls in Bunker 6. A private asked if relief was real or morale theater. Joe pointed to the clock again. If command tells me to keep stew on time during artillery, someone up there has a plan. Eat. At 16:03, coalition assault waves crossed perimeter markers. At 16:07, hidden human artillery opened from shafts previously masked as water recycling vents. At 16:11, the first relief cruisers emerged from cloud and fired on siege vessels, holding the thinned western arc that Vore had stripped for his rushed Day 4 assault geometry. The ring began to tear. The breakout was not cinematic. It was procedural violence executed with frightening discipline. Human armor companies moved through pre-cleared lanes created by civilians who had spent Day 3 clearing debris after equal ration policy restored trust. No ration riots had choked those routes, so evacuation traffic moved out while reserve squads moved in on the same schedule without collapse at the junctions. Signals traffic stayed embedded in meal channels until jamming collapsed under the volume of active battle networks. Joe's micro-galleys continued serving where possible because troops rotating through breach points still needed fuel and because continuity under fire reduced panic in shelters, now hearing friendly guns outside the ring. Admiral Vore attempted to reconfigure fleet geometry, yet his reserves were committed to Ten's rushed assault posture. The weak arc could not close before relief destroyers split it again. By 2230, local coalition ground units were fragmented into isolated pockets with degraded orbital support. Marshal 10 demanded no retreat directives and punitive bombardment on retreat corridors. Vore refused her in public for the first time in the campaign. He sent an open-channel message to Lena requesting conditional ceasefire talks for extraction of wounded crews and civilians caught between lines. Lena accepted talks under immediate fire pause zones and medical corridor guarantees. Envoy Tal Ren of the neutral systems, already en route from a nearby station due to escalation alerts, arrived before dawn to mediate terms. Tal Ren's presence solved a problem human command could not solve alone. Before neutral mediation, any surrender deal risked future claims of coercion or fabrication. With Tal Ren recording proceedings under recognized intersystem protocol, compliance obligations became enforceable beyond the battlefield. The initial ceasefire session took place in a damaged transit museum surrounded by shattered glass cases and an intact statue of the city's first survey crew. Joe stood security detail near the rear door, still smelling of smoke and broth concentrate. Vore entered in full command armor, eyes hollowed by 40 hours without rest. 10 entered last, furious and rigid, and attempted to challenge venue legitimacy before talks opened. Tal Ren shut that down in 12 words. You are encircled, recorded, and represented. Procedure exists. Sit down. Vore offered phased withdrawal with retention of heavy naval assets. Lena rejected it. She demanded full disarmament inside Cinder 9 operational range, release of all detainees, surrender of strike logs, and signed acknowledgement of unlawful targeting orders against communal food infrastructure. 10 called the terms theatrical revenge and threatened renewed orbital fire. Relief cruisers shifted into visible firing alignment through the museum skylight. 10 went silent. Vore asked for guarantees for surrendered crews. Lena gave them, and this was where mercy altered the war's political outcome. Coalition personnel who powered down weapons and submitted to inspection would receive medical treatment, food, and repatriation processing under neutral supervision. No summary reprisals, no starvation confinement, no retaliatory humiliation broadcasts. That clause resolved intense revenge pressure inside Havelock. Families had lost homes to kitchen strikes. Soldiers had carried friends from rubble. Calls for punitive treatment were real and loud. Lena addressed city representatives directly and made the logic plain. If we abandon law when law is hardest, we teach every enemy to fight to extinction next time. We need this war to end in a way that can stay ended. Joe added his own rough version to platoon channels, less elegant and equally effective. Feed prisoners, count prisoners, send them home after signatures. Dead enemies teach nothing. By midday day 5, organized coalition resistance on Cinder 9 ended. Vore signed surrender terms witnessed by Tal Ren, Lena Ibarra, and 2 neutral legal officers. Marshal 10 refused to sign and attempted to transmit unauthorized strike commands from a secondary comm band. Nadia's team jammed the burst in under 4 seconds and logged the attempt. The city did not celebrate immediately. Havelock spent 48 hours doing hard arithmetic of damage, casualties, water purity, and fuel reserves. Joe's 24 microgalleys became emergency feeding points for wounded civilians and disarmed coalition crews awaiting transfer. Dr. Rai worked triage nutrition shifts and began compiling data he never expected to collect outside the simulation. His notes became the basis for the 4-day metabolic stability protocol, later adopted by several defense forces and disaster agencies. Admiral Vore remained in monitored custody under armistice conditions, cooperative, visibly altered by defeat and by what he had learned too late. During one recorded debrief, He spoke without Ten's ideological script. I believed communal eating signaled softness. I observed your soldiers share portions with civilians under bombardment and concluded morale theater. My interpretation directed fire where you were strongest, not weakest. I gave you the blind spot you needed. In 2030-420, the Armistice Tribunal convened across 3 neutral stations with evidence archives from both sides. Nadia's intercepts, including Ten's primitive feasting directive and authorized strike chains, anchored the prosecution of unlawful targeting intent. Vore testified, accepted command responsibility, and avoided theatrical self-justification. Ten denied everything until relay logs contradicted her line by line. The tribunal censured coalition leadership, removed Ten from office through her own government's emergency statute, and codified explicit protection for food infrastructure in siege law, ending the old ambiguity inherited from the 2318 treaty text. That legal change mattered beyond language. Military planners across the corridor adjusted targeting doctrine, logistics resilience standards, and neutral inspection triggers for future conflicts. Command colleges taught Cinder 9 as a case study in how contempt distorts intelligence and how routine can become a weapon when routine preserves thinking minds. Joe Park, who had entered the siege as an infantry platoon sergeant with a side duty everyone joked about until shells started falling, received promotion to warrant officer and assignment to doctrine reform. He spent the next years writing manuals no one confused with poetry, yet every page carried the same premise he had defended on day 1. People decide wars, and people think better when fear does not own their stomachs. Captain Lena Ibarra took command of a joint reconstruction task group on Cinder 9, supervising infrastructure repair and reintegration programs for districts that had been shelled hardest. Her insistence on equal ration legitimacy during the siege gave her post-war administration uncommon credibility with civilians who had every reason to distrust uniforms, and city councils later cited that equal ration record when they ratified her reconstruction authority without the unrest many post-siege governments face. She used that credibility to reopen schools, rewire water sectors, and set transparent procurement rules before corruption could colonize relief budgets. Dr. Eamon Rhee published the 4-Day Metabolic Stability Protocol in 2034 with data appendices from Havelock. His preface stayed characteristically blunt. Prepared stocks keep bodies alive. Shared hot intake and predictable timing keep urban command coherent under bombardment. Corporal Nadia Volkov received commendation for signal interception and for the meal traffic camouflage method that saved the relief synchronization after the 11-hour jump delay. She later taught encryption tradecraft to joint units, opening each course with one sardonic line that made recruits uneasy in the right way. If your enemy calls you primitive, check whether he has stopped listening. Envoy Tal Ren departed Cinder 9 after treaty ratification with reputation enhanced and patience exhausted. Neutral diplomacy had paid for itself in blood saved, and Tal Ren spent the next cycle pushing standardized surrender verification across contested corridors so future commanders could not hide behind procedural ambiguity. Admiral Vore was repatriated under armistice terms after compliance milestones were met, restricted from command pending coalition review. Reports from his later lectures at coalition staff academies described a man stripped of arrogance and fluent in uncomfortable lessons. He reportedly told one class that contempt is an intelligence failure disguised as confidence, and no censor suite can correct a commander who has decided in advance what the enemy is allowed to be. The 6th year after the siege, in 2034, Cinder 9 hosted a joint memorial and military exchange on siege ethics. The city had rebuilt enough to hold the ceremony in the same district where the first main kitchen had been cratered on day 1. A new civic hall stood there now, modest, practical, with reinforced foundations and a public kitchen designed as both community space and protected emergency node under revised intersystem law. Joe arrived in warrant insignia, slower in the knees, identical in tone. He found Miri, the cook he had pulled from rubble, now chief coordinator for municipal emergency feeding. She handed him a ladle engraved with the names of all 24 micro galleys and said, "Try not to lose this one." Joe answered, "I only lose things under artillery, and I am officially retired from that hobby." Lena stood with Tal, Wren, and delegation officers from former coalition states, including junior representatives tasked with implementing the food protection clauses their predecessors had resisted. Children from rebuilt districts served ceremonial first portions to veterans, civilians, and visiting cadets from both former sides. No one pretended memory had softened. The point of the day was different. During the exchange forum, Lena delivered a final address that closed the arc started under shellfire. Her words were formal, careful, and aimed at young officers whose future crises would arrive with their own seductive myths. History records that this city survived 5 days under siege before relief broke the ring. Records also show why survival held. We treated feeding as command function, not charity. We enforced equal dignity under pressure, which preserved labor, trust, and legitimacy. We accepted surrender and gave mercy under supervision, which made a stable armistice politically possible. The galaxy once treated our restraint as evidence of weakness. That interpretation collapsed here. Strength includes discipline strong enough to keep law when revenge feels easier. Strength includes planning that outlives pride. Strength includes feeding civilians and prisoners because civilization is measured under strain, not ceremony. For 23 years before this siege, we practiced patience. During 5 days of bombardment, we practiced resolve. We hoped our opponents would choose better once warned. They chose poorly. The outcome is visible around you, in a rebuilt city, and in a treaty amended by hard experience. Respect is no longer requested. It is now the prevailing operating assumption across these lanes. Admiral Vore listened from the second row as a guest under armistice protocol. He stood when invited, approached the memorial flame, and placed a simple metal marker inscribed with coalition casualties and Havelock civilian dead in the same line. No hierarchy, no excuse. Some in the crowd stayed seated, some watched in cold silence. No one interrupted. Mercy had never required amnesia. After the ceremony, a cadet asked Joe the question that had followed him for 6 years. "Did you really know on day 1 that meals would decide the siege?" Joe looked over the plaza, where former enemies were eating from the same field kitchen, and children were chasing each other between exhibits explaining targeting law revisions they should never need to test. He gave the cadet an answer small enough to remember under stress. "I knew what failure looked like. Hungry people stop trusting orders. Once trust goes, maps do not matter." Sunset lit the city's repaired towers, and transport lights climbed through clear air where bombardment smoke once hung. The memorial exchange closed on schedule because schedules had become a kind of civic promise in Havelock, one built during a week when clocks and ladles carried as much consequence as rifles. Tal Wren's shuttle lifted for the neutral lanes. Lena returned to reconstruction briefings. Nadia returned to training labs, returned to his research cohort. Joe stayed long enough to help clean the kitchen floor, out of habit and preference. No unresolved threat waited beyond the horizon. The siege had ended. The antagonists had been defeated. Unlawful conduct had been judged, mercy had been enacted, and the legal order had absorbed the lesson. Across the Helios corridor, fleets now tagged food infrastructure as protected by default under the 2,342 clauses, and commanders who considered contempt a substitute for analysis did so under the shadow of Sindir 9. On the 4th day of the siege, Admiral Vor finally understood why humans kept eating on time while shells fell, and his rushed attempt to crush that system exposed the fleet geometry the relief force used to break him. On the 5th day, he signed surrender papers under the same clocks that had fooled him. 6 years later, the galaxy taught his mistake as foundational doctrine. Human patience had been mistaken for weakness, human routine for indulgence, human mercy for softness. The record now showed each assumption failing in sequence, and a new order standing where those assumptions broke.